The boxers have been given their instructions. The seconds are out. The crowd is ready for another edition of Shoulder Roll Virtual Boxing with your presenter, the boxing historian, Greg Rashid.
I want to say swade kalop to everyone out there. This is Greg Rashid with another edition of the Shoulder Roll Virtual Boxing Podcast. If you're new to the program, swade kalop means hello in Thai, and I'm in Bangkok, Thailand. Very, very hot here, but it's always hot here, but extra hot here. Hope you're having a great day wherever you are in this universe. I'm enjoying it here, and I just want to thank so many folks that are tuning in all over the world. And I don't know how to thank all of you, but just thank you so much. And I want to say a special thanks, as always, to those who listen every Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m. Mountain Time in Colorado on KUHSdenver.com, created by the one and only, the legendary Henry Archuleta. And I want to say hi to all my friends in the Colorado region, including those I haven't met yet. I know I'm getting back there. I'll be back there. I always say that at some point. But right now, I'm in Southeast Asia, enjoying it. And we're going to put on, hopefully, as always, a great show. And if you're tuning in, you love boxing. And for you new folks, what we do on here is we do fantasy fights. We take various modalities, computer games, card and dice games, and create fantasy fights. What would happen if Joe Louis fought Mike Tyson? What if Muhammad Ali fought Tyson Fury? And just mix things up, and we have those type of fights on here. But today we're going to do something a little different, because I always say, besides doing the fantasy fights, we talk about real life boxing, what's going on in the world of boxing, the history of boxing, also other combat sports, and we have interviews with boxers and authors today. And today, I'm just honored to have Steve Hunt, all the way from Britain. And he's going to talk about his new book on boxing, heavyweight boxing in the 1980s. So I'm going to get to the interview right now. Hope you enjoy it. And we'll be back on the other side. But right now, we're going to listen to this great interview with Steve Hunt. All right, listeners, I'm so happy to have on the program today the author of an excellent book. If you're a boxing historian, aficionado like I am, you're going to love this book. And I have to say, too, even if you're not, if you're just a casual fan, I think you will enjoy this book. And the book I'm talking about is Heavyweight Title Fights of the 1980s, A Complete History. Now, I repeat, A Complete History. It's done by the author, Steve Hunt. And we have him on here today. Are you there, Steve?
I am indeed. Yeah, thank you for inviting me on. It's brilliant to talk to you.
I am so happy to talk to you. I was so surprised when, because McFarlane is one of the regular publishing companies that always send me like PDFs. When I lived in America, they would send me books. And I've been interviewing their authors for goodness, over 20 years now. So when I saw this one listed, I said, oh my God, you talk about a much needed book, because this is overdue. Because a lot of folks, as you say in the book, and I want you to elaborate on how you decided to do it, but basically, even casual fans of boxing, they will know, if you're talking about the 80s, they may know Larry Holmes. They knew he was a champion because in the early 80s, his fights were on regular television. And then everyone all over the world knew Mike Tyson. But in that middle ground, and some of the guys they fought, these are people heavyweights that a lot of folks don't remember. So I just want you to talk about them, and also talk about what obviously I've already gave you the answer away, but what inspired you to write this particular book?
Well, it's the first book I've written.
Oh, really?
So
I wouldn't know that. Yeah. I wouldn't know that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've been writing for a little while, and I've only been writing articles. So the format of this book, because it covers every heavyweight title fight of the 1980s, as it says in the title, it was a easy concept for me to get my head around because it's essentially 46 separate articles that, when put together, create an overarching narrative.
Right.
So it was a straightforward format for me to write for my first book. So in terms of the format, that's why I like the idea of it. But I really enjoy that decade. It was the decade that I grew up in. I was just the right age for when Tyson burst onto the scene. And as I've got older, I've really come to appreciate and respect Larry Holmes as one of the greatest heavyweight champions. And I think too often the other fighters around them, as you've mentioned, are too often forgotten. And they're often given this label of the lost generation of heavyweights. And I understand why that is. But I think that's unfair to some degree. And I thought it was worth shining a light on them. I think every decade in the heavyweight history has had fighters who haven't reached their potential, who've been outshone maybe by more dominant fighters. But that doesn't mean that they should be overlooked. And with the 80s
right.
being obviously slap bang between the glorious 70s of Ali, Frazier, Foreman, and the likes, and the lesser fighters of that decade, the likes of Ron Lyle, and then you've got the 90s, which is much fresher in many people's memories, with the likes of Bo Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, and so on. I think the 80s is kind of, obviously sandwiched in the middle there and slightly forgotten. And yes, it is the first half of the book and the first half of the decade is pretty much dominated by Larry Holmes, and then the second half of the decade is dominated by the rise of Tyson. But I think the sport changed so much over that time, as you've already suggested, with free TV, the bulk of the boxing being on at the start of the decade, and everyone being able to watch Larry Holmes, and then the introduction or rise of HBO in the second part of the decade. But it was the HBO that brought together the unification series, which allowed one heavyweight champion to be crowned. So I just thought all those factors put together make it a really interesting decade.
And it certainly was. And listeners out there who don't really understand, because I have a lot of younger listeners, you really don't appreciate seeing boxing, heavyweight boxing, on live, regular television in the evenings. I mean, think about it. I saw all of Larry Holmes's fights on television, and the fact that they built up some of these guys he fought that nobody had heard of, like Leroy Jones. You have him on at prime time. I remember I was living in Washington, D.C., 8 o'clock. They're showing Holmes versus Jones. And I'm a boxing historian even then. I'm in my early 20s, and I don't even know who Leroy Jones is. But they're building him up. And they're getting ratings. People are looking at this fight of this guy who is he? But it's because it's a primetime show, and it is the heavyweight champion of the world, Larry Holmes, fighting. And that's a whole different experience than what goes on today. Now, I want to ask you, because you did mention HBO, was that good or was that bad for heavyweight boxing and also boxing in general?
Well, I think the way that sport has gone generally, I mean, I can only really speak about sport in the UK where I live.
Right.
And over time, virtually all sport now has disappeared behind a paywall of some description. So there's very little sport that you can watch on free-to-air TV in the UK. And I understand that's probably pretty much the same in the US.
Yeah.
So as I said, a good example is this HBO unification series. That wouldn't have happened without the HBO money. But once you introduce a paywall, fewer people are watching the sport. So the fighters get well paid. The fighters are being better paid today than they ever have been. But there's fewer people watching it. So, how do you balance that? It depends on how you feel about that. You will find people who say that boxing is a booming sport, and you'll find people that say boxing is a dying sport. I'm probably more inclined to say the latter, because I don't think when, the numbers of viewers for that huge show they put on in Saudi a few months ago was only watched in the tens of thousands.
Right.
That doesn't bode well for the future of the sport. But the current fighters are being very well paid, and the origins of that really started in the mid 80s when HBO came along and that paywall came into place. So there's good about it because it helped make fights and it cleared up to some degree for a period at least the confusion as to who was the heavyweight champion of the world. But any time you introduce a paywall, fewer people are going to watch that event or sport. For instance, in this country, back in the 80s, the likes of Barry McGuigan, who was a hugely popular fighter in the UK,
right?
He was boxing on terrestrial TV, as we call it over here, in the mid 80s, and you'd get 18, 20 million people watching that fight. And in this country, that's a huge, nothing gets bigger ratings than that. The most popular TV shows in the country won't get better ratings than that. Now, boxing won't get a fraction of that. You won't get 1 million people watching a boxing match in the UK if it's not on free TV, and very little boxing is on free TV. So it's a conundrum. It depends how you feel about the money as opposed to people having access to the sport.
Right. And the main thing is to take care of the fighters. And unfortunately, because he's a looming dark cloud throughout your book. I want you to talk about Don King, the promoter, and his effect on heavyweight boxing in the 1980s. And I keep saying heavyweight boxing because the book is about heavyweight boxing. But
yes, yeah.
At the same time, we got to keep in mind, you have in the lower weights, that's booming. You got Sugar Ray Leonard, Hagler, all these folks, and they're on primetime TV in America. And they're getting more attention. In fact, some of them are getting commercials on television in America that the heavyweights aren't getting. But talk about Don King and his role, or his nefarious role in everything in the 80s.
Yeah, I think I've said plenty of times now that I think some people look back with slightly rose-tinted glasses about Don King because he's this very elderly man and he's a bit of a kind of a caricature figure. He was a brilliant businessman, the hardest working promoter, but he wasn't a good man. He was you just got to look at the amount of fighters that have had lawsuits against Don King. He was in prison for the first Ali Frazier fight, and he promoted the third Ali Frazier fight, which just shows how quickly once he was released from prison, he established his control in the sport. He was fundamental in making the Rumble in the Jungle, Ali Foreman, come together. So you've got to give him credit. He achieved things that other promoters weren't able to achieve. But also, I think he did leave a stain, particularly on that 80s, as we're talking about the 80s, on that 80s time frame, because so many fighters weren't being looked after, they weren't being treated well, they weren't being paid well, and because many of these fighters were an easily discouraged bunch of characters, when they felt like they weren't getting getting treated well, they were having, they were signing blank contracts or contracts weren't being honoured. They didn't fulfill their potential. Now, you can't blame King for all of that, of course.
Right.
But, some of the blame can be put at their door. Larry Holmes was often unhappy with Don King, but Larry Holmes was a very special man and he was able to just keep going anyway. And he was thinking, well, I'm being ripped off, but if I just keep going, just keep fighting, just keep winning, I'll get plenty of money at the end of the day. Whereas other fighters weren't quite able to do that, with the classic example being Tim Witherspoon. Tim Witherspoon won a version of the title and felt, now was the time for the big money, and he hardly ever made any money, and he couldn't understand why. How much of that was Don King's fault? A large part. Some of it was Tim's fault. Tim didn't have good advice. Tim was easily manipulated. Tim was, always thinking, a lot of these fighters felt, now I'm champion, the money will never stop coming in, and were spending it as quick as they were earning it. But yeah, I mean, Don King famously ripped off Muhammad Ali in the fight, in his not final fight, but penultimate fight against Larry Holmes. So I mean, that fight in itself is a travesty. But Muhammad Ali didn't even get paid the amount that was on his contract, and that's down to Don King. And I think that's despicable. So yeah, Don King, I've got no time for Don King, really. Credit to him, brilliant promoter. When the whole history of boxing is written, he's up there with the top of the greatest promoters, and he made events happen that other people couldn't. But he was always looking out for number one.
Yeah.
You know, that was his main concern was, you know, what I'll come out on top. You know, I'll come out on top. What I think is interesting when we just briefly we reflect to now, the one thing that he always ensured was the show has got to make money ultimately, so he would make money. So the fighters would have to accept purses that could only be paid by virtue of what he was getting from TV and ticket money. And
right.
that model doesn't exist anymore, because with the Saudi involvement in boxing, that, you know, the Saudis don't mind losing money, and that's why the so many of the fighters' purses are astronomical, and the shows lose cash. But Don King, you know, he had to make money, you know, and he would make money even if it cost the fighters.
Yeah, that was the thing. And one thing you bring up in the book that I shouldn't say I forgot about, but you're probably the only author that's even mentioned this in all the boxing books I read and magazines I read. His dabbling with South Africa, because that's a main issue during that time, and talk about that and how he kind of changes his viewpoints.
Yeah, well, that's a good example of him only really caring about himself and how to make money, and would happily discard fighters once he felt they were no longer valuable commodities, because I think that's pretty much how he saw fighters. So early in the decade, Bob Arum was doing business in South Africa, and Don King was a huge critic of Bob Arum for doing that. And King made a big point of publicly criticizing anyone that did business in South Africa. But then when Jerry Coetzee comes on the scene, and then you've got a white heavyweight, and everyone knows back in those days that white heavyweights were going to be marketable, especially in the relatively quick aftermath after Jerry Cooney and that financial bonanza.
Right.
Don King found himself with a share of Jerry Coetzee, and saw how this could be financially extremely rewarding for him. But he also knew the damage, the reputational damage it could do to him because of what he'd said previously and the situation in South Africa. So he sold his share. I can't remember the actual details now off the top of my head, but basically he made money out of a fight that Jerry Coetzee had down in South Africa, but basically Don King took his name off it, so that he didn't look like he was doing something that, you know, would be frowned upon by people who were fighting the cause against apartheid in South Africa. I think it's famously $1 million he made. Jack Newfield wrote a fantastic book, The Life and Crimes of Don King, and it's detailed at great length in there. But that was, and there was Arthur Ashe was head of an organization. Again, I forget what the organization was called, but it was essentially an organization that was campaigning for athletes and artists to steer clear of apartheid South Africa. And Don King was a founding member of that organization. But when this business with Jerry Coetzee came up, and Don King's opportunity to make money with South Africa, he left that organization before he was kicked out, basically. So it is a good example of Don King basically not really caring about issues of race. If it served his bank balance, then he would do it.
It's amazing. You know, I don't want to turn this into the Don King show in a sense, but it's amazing that he's still around and still promoting. He has to be in his 90s.
He's in his 90s. Yeah.
Yeah, because Aaron's in his 90s. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. He's virtually in retirement, though, isn't he now? He's very inactive, but he is still alive, and he does turn up every now and again. You see his face pop up.
Yeah. And I know he promoted a fight last year. There was a obscure heavyweight he had. He was just promoting him. So he's still...
Yeah, well, only a couple of years ago, Daniel Dubois,
That's right.
the UK's heavyweight. He fought for some bogus WBA
That's right.
over in the States in a bit of a shambolic promotion. And Don King didn't even pay Daniel Dubois. So even after all these years, he's still up to the same trick. And obviously Frank Warren, who looks after Dubois, had to help Dubois go to court
My
to get Don King
goodness.
to pay up. So after all these years, nothing has changed with Don.
Hey,
If he can get out of paying, it seems that he will.
my goodness. I mean, you never, some folks never change. That's
Yeah,
what he
yeah,
knew. That's what he knows,
yeah. I mean, when you look at his relationship with Mike Tyson, he exploited Mike Tyson, and there's some interesting quotes from Mike Tyson about Don King in my book. But when Tyson, Don King would put these promotions on with Mike Tyson at the top of them, and fill the undercard with many of King's other fighters, and their purses would be taken out of Mike Tyson's purse.
Yeah. I mean, that's amazing. That's amazing. But
Yeah, I think it was Julian Jackson, if I remember rightly, got his best ever payday on a Don King promotion, but the money came from Tyson's share.
and,
It's
Tyson,
nuts. It's crazy.
it's just really something. But and for those of you just tuning in who just turned in, if we're taping the show, but I know some of you turn in, listen to my show midway through. I'm talking with Steve King, the author of the book Heavyweight Title Fights of the 1980s: A Complete History. It's on McFarland Press. Now, when you look back on this, and I like what you say at the end of the book about, and if you could say what you said about how you felt after watching 46 fights.
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead.
I could. I watched a lot more than 46 because
That's
I was
true.
watching, the fights between the contenders.
Right.
But yeah, I loved it. It was great. It was great. I could. There was a friend of mine who's bought the book who was telling me about. He was starting to watch the fights as he was reading the book, and it started making me think about what I wanted to go back and watch them again.
Yeah. Because you got me looking, I got the book, but I said, I got to look at some of these fights. And there's, some of those guys, when I looked at them, I said, God, some of these guys really were better than I thought. And I want to mention one in particular who I just kind of shrugged off at the time in the 80s and all, and actually didn't see many of his fights, but looking at him again, Pinklin Thomas was a solid heavyweight.
Yes, his peak was all too brief.
Yeah.
He came from a really tough background. He had an awful drug addiction when he was not even a teenager, but managed to get himself clean with the help of his wife and with the help of the sport. And he kind of came from nowhere to upset Tim Witherspoon, and that was an upset to win the WBC title. And that is still a kind of it's a strange result but he clearly won that fight, and he beat Witherspoon to a large degree with his jab. He had an amazing jab, and then he had a defense against Mike Weaver where he knocked Weaver out in the 8th round with a beautiful right hand. And then strangely, again, he lost the title in an upset to Trevor Berbick. And that's an even weirder result, really, because, again, you would pick, at that point in time, you would have picked Pinklin Thomas to beat Trevor Berbick. But I think Pinklin Thomas took his eye off the ball. He had eyes on a bit of a singing career, a couple of fighters. And I think he took Berbick for granted, and Berbick was fired up. And it was also the winner of that fight was going to go and face Mike Tyson,
right?
In what would have been Mike Tyson's first challenge for a title. So Pinklin Thomas blew that basically, and Trevor Berbick got the dubious honor of facing Tyson next, but the payday that came with that. So yeah, Pinklin Thomas was a really solid fighter. All the fundamentals, and sometimes that can take you a long way. At his peak, he could go 12 rounds. He had a fantastic jab, decent stamina, decent chin, good right hand. Those fundamentals will take you a long way.
Yeah, and there's another fight. Well, I'll ask you, who of all the fighters you looked at in the 80s, we're not talking about Larry Holmes or Mike Tyson, but who did you favor? Who did you like? Looking at the fights again and saying this guy should have been this, he should have been bigger.
I would say the best fighter of that period is Larry Holmes. The second best fighter, I would say, is Mike Tyson. I think those two are quite comfortably ahead of the crowd behind them. After that, it becomes quite difficult because they really are a bunch of flawed fighters. And if you look at those records, they were winning and losing to each other. I would probably choose say Tim Witherspoon is a better fighter than Pinklon Thomas, but as we've just said, he lost to Pinklon Thomas, so that kind of doesn't make much sense. But if you look at their resumes, you would put on their resume alone, you would put Witherspoon ahead of Pinklon Thomas. The likes of Tony Tubbs, really good fighter, actually. Tremendous amateur record, clearly a better amateur than a pro. Despite his body shape, he had a good engine. He was durable until he ran into Mike Tyson. He was chosen for that Tyson fight in Tokyo because he was considered really durable. But sadly for Tubbs, he got blown away in 2 rounds, of course. The likes of Mike Weaver. Mike Weaver is a good fighter, slightly vulnerable to a big punch. But, he gave a good young Larry Holmes a really tough fight. He obviously won the title from John Tate with a last round knockout victory. So, Mike Weaver, in that part of his career, always turned up in shape, and his punch always gave him a chance.
Mike Weaver is someone, in my mind, who someone should write a book about it. And maybe there's been a book written about him, because his life is just fascinating. He's just a fascinating guy. And he endured everything. He knew he was bright enough to know what was going on around him. I don't think you can correct me, Steve, if I'm wrong. I don't think he was ripped off by King or anything. I think he was his own promoter, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, he was unlucky. I mean, he got well paid. He's the fighter that in that early part of that decade went down to South Africa and beat Jerry Kitsia.
Right.
So he would have got paid well then. But I mean, I don't think he was in those days, unless, not everyone was even aware of the apartheid regime, unless you followed news and culture and so forth. So I don't hold it against Mike Weaver for going down to South Africa. But I mean, he was in line for when Jerry Cooney was storming through the ranks. Mike Weaver could have got the Jerry Cooney fight, which would have been huge, but ultimately Cooney faced Holmes and lost in a huge financial blockbuster. But you do wonder if Jerry Cooney had fought Mike Weaver, what the outcome could have been there. And I think it was the WBA who played a part in that fight not happening, because for one reason or another, I think Mike Weaver hadn't made a mandatory defense for a while. So the WBA insisted that he fought James Tillis, of all people, in a stinker of a fight, which Mike Weaver won. But yeah, Mike Weaver's a fascinating character. I mean, he was really, really a part-time fighter when he first started, and he would admit that. I think he was losing as many fights as he was winning in those very early days, because he wasn't training, he wasn't running, he was just taking fights at short notice. But then he got a manager that showed an interest in him, and he decided to give it a go. And he made a huge success, really, of what he had.
He definitely did. And something you say at the end of the book, I really like that you say this. You talk about, let's tell my listeners about some of the guys who were maligned, but on the other hand, you say that they fought in the 90s and they fought well. And you kind of allude to the fact that if they were around right now, they would be contenders and they'd be champions.
Yes. I mean, I think, right now we've got a really good champion, Alexander Usyk. But some of those, I don't think the likes of Witherspoon, the likes of even Tubbs, which some people might not like me saying that, the likes of Tubbs, the likes of Mike Weaver, the likes of Greg Page. Yeah. I think if they were around now, they would be contenders. They would give the champions. Greg Page is going the distance with Alexander Usyk if they're meeting in their primes. There's no doubt about it, in my mind anyway. And I think, as you've just mentioned, some of these fighters were giving really good tests to some of the highly regarded fighters in the 90s, when these 80s guys were well past their peak. Tony Tubbs, for one. Tubbs fought an unbeaten Riddick Bowe when Riddick Bowe was only a couple of fights from his world title shot, and he took Bowe the distance in a very close fight. Tim Witherspoon was fighting well past his peak into the mid-90s and turning in some good results, which I just think it doesn't prove everything, but I think it is a reminder that they were good fighters, but they were flawed fighters, and that's not, that's not unusual. I've said before as well, the likes of Riddick Bowe, who is very well thought of now, it seems to me, he would have fit perfectly in that 80s bunch of a guy that didn't have the full package. You
Right.
know, Bowe won the title and was never as good again. You know, that's typical 80s material, that is.
That's it. I mean, that is it there. That's how you do it. But we're getting ready to run out of time here, and I want to ask you, what do you hope the readers get out of your book? The one thing that you want them to get out of this book?
I hope they read the book and just have a greater appreciation for that era and don't overlook it and don't just dismiss those fighters as no good. There were interesting characters, fascinating storylines, interesting characters, and and an appreciation of Larry Holmes as well. I think, who was still slightly not given his full due.
No, because I alternate between Ali. I consider Ali the greatest heavyweight of all time, but then again, I say Larry Holmes may be one. Ali may be 1A, and Holmes, to me, may be 1B.
Right.
And there are moments when I say, at their peaks, I think Holmes may have beaten Ali. He could have beaten Ali. And I waver. I waver from that. I go off and on, in and out on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think Larry Holmes goes the distance with any fighter in history. So that puts him in the conversation for being amongst the best. And I think it's so hard. I mean, I would personally just go with Ali over Holmes just because of the variety of his game, as opposed to, Holmes is what he is. He was an outstanding fighter with all the attributes to be a really good heavyweight. But I just think, over 15 rounds, I think you'd probably edge it towards Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, like I say, I waver, and Ali always he thinks of a way to win. When it looks like he's not going to win it, he'll think of something to figure it out. But like I said, I waver in that. I really waver with that. But yeah, and anything else you want your readers to get out of the book? Anything else?
Not really. I think it's interesting looking back on that HBO series, and I think people forget now that Mike Tyson wasn't in that to begin with. It wasn't put together as a tool or route for Mike Tyson. He just forced his way in, and I think it is worth reflecting back on Tyson's glory years, because too often we think of him in the 90s when he's more infamous than famous. And through that brief period, turning pro in, I think, March '85. Winning the WBC title in November '96, in November '86, he is phenomenal. And that the pace at that, the way that how often he was fighting to wrap those 3 titles up is quite incredible and something really interesting to reflect on.
I think I agree with that wholeheartedly. And it's so funny you say that, as far as how many times he was fighting it, during that time. I just saw a quote from Deontay Wilder, the former heavyweight champion, and he's saying he's coming back. And he was saying, I'm going to fight a lot this year, maybe 1 or 2 fights. I said, a lot? 1 or 2 fights? And you got Tyson fighting every other month, sometimes every month. I mean, it's amazing. So, but it's a different sport, different world now in a sense. But I really want to thank you for writing the book. It's a fun book, for a boxing historian like myself, and also just I would think for a casual fan. It's just fun reading, going online and looking at some of these fights and just saying, wow, these guys are really something, and this is a way.
I appreciate that.
And it's a way for, you have brought back a lot of folks. I hope that people really appreciate these guys. And before we wrap this up, I have to ask you, because there's a big event coming on your side of the world. This fight this weekend between Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn. What's your take on it?
Well, look, my take on it is that I can't stand Conor Benn, and Conor Benn shouldn't be fighting. Ultimately, because he produced 2 positive drug tests in the lead up to the original contest. And he has always skirted the appropriate disciplinary routes. So he's never, ever offered publicly an explanation as to why those tests came up positive.
Right.
He's only managed to get a license back to fight basically in this country because he's got very expensive lawyers. And I think it's a disgrace that he is fighting. And I think it's a terrible stain on the sport. And it just shows that PED use in boxing is not taken seriously enough. And so long as these, the fight, if you look at his, I saw a really interesting tweet from Boxing Scene that listed Eubank's best 5 results and Ben's best 5 results, and Ben hasn't fought anyone and beat anyone of any substance. He's a pure media creation.
I guess the closest person would be Chris Algieri, who's a
and at the time,
fight. Yeah.
Ben was a welterweight. Algieri was an aged light welterweight.
Right.
And there was a huge question mark now over Conor Benn in terms of was he using drugs at that stage? Right. Because I think that was either 1 or 2 fights before he got actually busted.
It was.
So
yes.
I don't think you can read anything into those results. The magnitude of this fight is so much to do with the legacy of their fathers, who in this country, were British boxing legends back in the day that we were talking about when these fights were on TV in front of 15 million, 20 million people, which again in this country is huge, huge viewing figures. I grew up in that era. I was at most of those fights between their fathers, and they were British boxing legends. If you removed the names from the fighters in this fight tomorrow night and just looked at their records, you wouldn't be interested in watching it.
Oh no, nobody's looking at this fight. No, nobody.
So it's a huge thing in this country. But I am slightly mystified. I think probably now that I'm slightly older, maybe I would have been caught up in the hype if I was 20 years younger than I am now. But this fight actually, unfortunately does really disappoint me that it's even happening. And I feel that any journalist who interviews Conor Benn in the lead up to this fight and doesn't ask him, why were those drugs in your system, should be ashamed of themselves. But I get the feeling that those journalists will be banned from asking that question. Right. And if they are banned from asking that question, they should refuse to interview him.
Right.
Because this is not okay. This is not okay for boxing.
No, it's not. And I wholeheartedly agree with everything you've said. And all of the interviews I have seen and listened to about the fights on British stations, no one has asked those questions. That's a shame.
No, and there's a reason they won't. Everyone
accessibility.
Wants to brush it.
They want accessibility.
Because you can't answer the question.
Yeah.
And I can't believe that they're not asking him. I mean, they're either inept as a journalist,
right,
or they've been banned, and they're still doing the interview. In which case they're not doing their job properly. Because if I'm going into an interview and I'm banned from asking a certain set of questions, I'm not doing it. Then you haven't got any integrity.
No, not at all. But Steve, I could talk to you all day. I got to get you back on here again. I want to thank you.
I'd be glad to. This is great. I'd be glad to do this again sometime.
Oh, we definitely got to do this again. What's your next book going to be?
Oh, well, I haven't got a definite set plan yet. I've had a few ideas and I've veered from one thing to the next. Okay. So I don't know whether I'm going to go diving in, but I'll hopefully be able to answer that question in a few months.
Okay.
Because it's such a big project,
and I need to be sure. Oh, how can anyone reach you? Got to mention that before we go. How can anyone reach you?
Well, I'm all over the place on social media. I think it's Mr. Steve Hunt on Twitter. I've got a website, stevehuntboxing.com, and you can contact me through there. You can easily find my stuff on Twitter, Instagram. I also do a podcast about boxing movies, which is Boxing Movie Podcast.
Oh, I got to check that out. I will check it out.
If you look at Boxing Movie Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, then you'll find me that way as well.
I didn't know that. I'll check you out. But Steve, thank you so much. Look forward to talking to you again. You take care. Thank you so much, buddy. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
And you. Thank you.
Really enjoyed talking to Steve today. That was a great interview. Great guy. Great book. Really check that book out. The Boxers, Heavyweight Boxing in the 1980s, A Complete History. It's on McFarland Press. And right now we're going to have Jessica come in and give us a little boxing history for the week. So take it away, Jessica.
This is Jessica, your martial arts champion with your boxing history for the week of April 27th through May 3rd. April 27th, 1956, Rocky Marciano announced his retirement and became the only heavyweight champion to finish his career undefeated, 49-0. April 28, 1967, Muhammad Ali refused induction into the Army and was stripped of his boxing title. April 29, 2017, Anthony Joshua stopped Vladimir Klitschko in the 11th round. April 30th, 1976, Muhammad Ali retained the world heavyweight title with a highly disputed 15-round unanimous decision over Jimmy Young. May 1st, 2010, Floyd Mayweather Jr. beat Shane Mosley to continue his undefeated career streak. May 2, 2015, Floyd Mayweather Jr. defeated Manny Pacquiao in the highest-grossing fight in boxing history. May 3, 2014, Floyd Mayweather Jr. beat Marcos Maidana by majority decision.
That's amazing that fight that Floyd had with Pacquiao 15 years ago. My goodness. No, I'm sorry, 10 years ago. But my goodness. That's amazing. And, Pacquiao, sometimes he mentions he'd like to get in the ring with him again, but we shall see. But anyway, Jessica has some more news about something that's going on this side of the world. I'm really excited about this. So let's see what Jessica has to say about this.
At the Thai embassy in Mexico City, it became official that the 63rd WBC convention will be held in conjunction with the WBC Muay Thai convention in Bangkok, Thailand. The simultaneous conventions, which are a combined first, will be held at the end of November. Before announcing this, an emotional tribute to honor and commemorate the passing of Pope Francis was shown. A video was shown which gave a glimpse of past WBC conventions in Thailand. As well as a video tribute to Thai boxing, this second video showed how Thai boxers won their championships. Present at the conference were WBC President Mauricio Sulaiman, Thai Ambassador to Mexico, H.E. Ruj Thamonkol, and President of the WBC Asian Boxing Council and International Secretary of the World Boxing Council, General Thanapol Bhaktibhumi. The WBC convention is a mega event where we will have important lectures, medical seminars, world rankings, mandatory fight session, awards, gala dinners, seminars for ring officials, WBC Cares visits, talent show, boxing billboard, among other activities. The World Boxing Council Muay Thai Convention will offer 2 days of workshops and training seminars for ring officials, world champions, championship fights, training workshops among a variety of events. World champions Humberto Chiquita Gonzalez, Adrian Confessor Hernandez, Jose Luis Bueno, and Jose Antonio Jaguar Aguirre received a medal making them official ambassadors of this convention. Mauricio Sulaiman gave a scale belt to Ambassador Tamonko. The WBC flag was given as a symbol of the commitment in these conventions. This way it is officialized that the WBC family will travel to Thailand to the convention.
Man, I already signed up. I got my membership and everything. I can't wait. Can't wait for that. Man, that's going to be a great convention over here in Bangkok. I can't wait. The WBC comes over to Bangkok. I can't wait for that. Man, I will be covering it on this show, definitely, on Shoulder Roll Virtual Boxing Podcast. But as I always say, this is a boxing variety show, so we're going to switch gears now with a little music. And this is a new one from Marshall Allen, the great alto sax, oboe player, flautist, you name it. And Marshall Allen, this is his first solo album. And Marshall Allen forever played with the Sun Ra Orchestra. And Marshall Allen also is 100 years old. And he turns 101 this year. And this is his first solo album, and he can still play. And I'm going to play this. This is from New Dawn. I'm going to play the cut, Are You Ready? So are you ready to hear Marshall Allen on the alto sax on the solo shoulder roll virtual boxing podcast.
place. Space is the place. Space is the place. Outer space is the pleasant place. A place that's free. There's no limit to the things that you can do. There's no limit to the things that you can be. Your thought is free, and your life is worthwhile. Space is the place. 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 Outer space is a pleasant place. A place that's really free. There's no limit to the things that you can do. There's no limit to the things that you can be. Your thought is free, and your life is worthwhile. Space is the place. 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 Out of space. Out of space. Out of space. Out of space.
And that's the classic. Space is the place. The Sun Ra and his orchestra from the early 70s that featured Marshall Allen on oboe along with John Gilmore on sax, the gorgeous June Dyson singing the leads there. Sun Ra on just about everything, on the organ, the piano, you name it. Sun Ra, one of the, I say actually, the best performance I've ever seen live by any group, in any genre, was Sun Ra's orchestra, and I saw them a number of times. You know, just amazing. But that was Space is the Place. And before that, we did the new one by Marshall Allen, who's on the oboe on his new cut, Are You Ready, from the album New Dawn. Check it out. But we got to get out of here now. You know, it's been so fun today. I want to thank again Steve Hunt, the author who I interviewed, the author of the book Heavyweight Title Fights of the 1980s, A Complete History. It's on McFarlane Press. Go get that book. You don't have to be a boxing aficionado. I mean, it's really a good book, period. You know, but if you love boxing, it'll make you go back and look at some of the videos of the fights on YouTube. Just check them out. It's just amazing because there were some very good fighters between Larry Holmes and Mike Tyson in the 80s. So check it out. Yeah, get that book on McFarlane Press. It's a great one. We're going to have Steve Hunt back on the program again very, very soon. But again, we got to get out of here now. This is Greg Rashid. Go in love and go in peace. Help someone along the way. And when you get up in the morning, get up, get out of that bed, look in that mirror, hug yourself and say, I love myself. And if you're sight impaired, get up, hug yourself and say, I love myself. Because you don't love yourself, you can't do anything. You can't love anyone. You can't do anything because you don't love yourself. So love yourself. Take care of your neighborhood, your community, wherever you are in this universe. Help a young person in need, a senior in need, an animal that may need your help. Whatever you can do to make the place a better place wherever you live, be it in the countryside, in the urban area, gated community, wherever, on an island, wherever you are, just do what you can. Pick up trash in your neighborhood. Don't wait for someone else to do it. Just do what you can to make it a better place. We're all on this big, big blue ball together. And we got to work together. There are wars and rumors of wars. And we got to do what we can in our own little itsy-bitsy way to make things better. So do what you can. But again, this is Greg Rashid. Happy as always to host this program and for having you be so kind to let me drop in your life for an hour a week. Really appreciate it. So go in love and go in peace. See you next time on the Shoulder Roll Virtual Boxing Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in. Please remember to like, comment, share and subscribe to this channel. Thanks and have a great day.